We need to talk a bit about Vendetta. There's been a lot of drama to do with Vendetta already, and the drama has mostly been to do with the obvious. Why is Vendetta not a tank? And why is Vendetta a DPS? There is memes. There's a meme. A whole year without tank is rough. I'm a bit concerned, right? The tank player base for 5v5 is in the worst spot it's ever been in terms of 5v5, apart from literally just before Season 9. And that was after about 6 months of Mauga. And 6 months of Roadhog and 6 months of absolute asinine gameplay in 5v5. And I'm concerned that what's going to happen is that we're going to, instead of being 1 minute for tank queues and 4 minute for DPS queues and 5 minute for support queues or 6 minute for support queues, I mean, we can check it now. Yes, your job is now to open Overwatch. So yeah, I'm concerned that immediately, instead of being 1, 4, 5, which is my experience, it's going to get worse. One of the things is that regardless of what happens, Blizzard can make it 1-3-3, right? Or they can make it roughly proportional to, like, this being 50% longer than this. And the reason they can do that is all they have to do is drop match quality, because it's very hard to tell how much match quality has been dropped, and it's very easy to tell if your queue times go higher. So essentially, you can have a massive buffer around match quality. It's kind of like surge pricing, where when the demand gets really split between the player base, you can just say, well, I'm just going to drop it for a little bit, and nobody will be able to tell. Because quite frankly, a good game mode should have some variance in the matches. We don't match up for like 50-50 games, right? Or at least I've always found, and I think this is borne out by Marvel Rivals, the engagement-based matchmaking, EOMM research. That essentially 50-50 matches continuously just burn people out. There needs to be some swingy matches. And if Blizzard makes it so that they've changed it from having some swingy matches to having a lot of swingy matches for a little bit, the player base can kind of buffer that mentally. So essentially, really what we're looking at is the proportion between these two in order to work out what's happening. Because we can't tell how bad the match quality is. We can't tell how bad the matchmaking is until the community kind of has an uproar on it. I really want to talk a little bit about player base numbers, because I think Blizzard has this kind of thing, and I think the community in general has this kind of thing where, oh, what are we going to do? World of Warcraft, tank player base numbers can never be changed in any way, shape, or form. I want to go through a little bit of history real quick of what's happened in Overwatch history in terms of role distribution numbers, because I've talked about it a fair bit in the past, but I haven't really gone through the history. There's a couple of touch points, and I think every single role has had the longest queues at this point. It's pretty obvious. I think tank has had the longest queues for the longest time, and I think tank probably is the hardest to get populated in a pinch. But realistically, every single role has had problems. So we started out with Overwatch 1 with the support player base numbers being at 3 when they launched it. So number 1 is Overwatch 1 was support, right? That's early. Number 2, I think DPS was always the most popular role in Overwatch 1 by far. But then the tank player base over time started getting a bit lax. First off, because we realized that we needed 2 tanks, and second off, because we actually didn't have any tanks to play. We had 2 initiators. We had Winston and we had Reinhardt. I mean, later on we had Ball. And we kind of had Orisa, so Orisa wasn't really an initiator. So you had this kind of situation where the main tank role was hilariously underfunded. And so tanks became incredibly unpopular. So tanks became unpopular there. So it started out with supports, then it moves to tanks. And then after that, we got through, well, it stayed on tanks because we went through goats, and then we went through double shield, and then we abandoned the video game. Which, I mean, it is what it is. So that stayed on tanks the rest of it. So starting there, we had supports, and then we had that bleed into tanks over time. Then Overwatch 2 launched, right? Overwatch 2 launched. Overwatch 2 and 5v5 in general made the support player base bleed badly. And the actual thing we were lacking there turned back to supports. The reason why it turned back to supports is because 5v5 was horribly overwhelming for all the Mercy mains. They were being killed from everywhere. They didn't know how to adapt. They took a long time to adapt. And I think the more passive support player base left in substantial droves. And at this point, by the way, towards the launch, the tank player base was actually really, really big proportionally to the 5v5 demand on it. And obviously we cut the demand, so that's not really a point of contention. But the support player base dropping off a cliff was definitely a point of a touch point of contention. Shortly after that, pretty much we made supports a lot more DPS-y, and support player base started rising again. So support player base started going back up. The reason for that was supports were now supports plus DPS, and DPS players were DPS minus support. because we just started. It's partially because the support players adapted to be able to be more DPS-y. 100% it is. But realistically, yeah, we just turned it into a second DPS queue, and we turned the DPS queue into a support queue that couldn't do anything. So then we had no DPS players. There was a significant time in Overwatch 2 where you had loads of supports and no DPS, and nobody wanted to play DPS. This is the only time in the history that DPS have been lacking, but it is a touch point, right? It is a thing to think about, right? When we make everything DPS lack definition. And then straight after that, because this happened, we did Season 9. Now, Season 9, and to be clear here, the tank queue was dying, and that was dying there because Malga, Roadhog, these characters were awful to play against. It was a really bad time. Malga pretty much dominated every other tank by doing tank hate. Tank hate was horribly oppressive. So Season 9 kind of brought the DPS queue back up. And then we did a load of tank buffs, right? The tank buffs happened shortly after Season 9. I think it was like a month or two after Season 9. We actually buffed them back up to the point where I think we did the armor changes. We did a big patch to make tanks more durable. We also changed the damage, DPS passive resistance on tanks again. So the tank queues started going back up there. And of course, when two things rise, the other thing falls. So support started being lacking again. There is one more touch point, I believe, at the end here. And that is from the supports being underpopulated, the tank queue just went back down. And we ended up now where tank queues are underpopulated, DPS are okay-ish, and especially in, say, 6v6 open queue supports, vastly overrepresented. There really is no clear finger on the trigger of what is underpopulated and what people don't want to play. It really is, in my opinion, completely dependent of what's good to play. And now, I think support and DPS are more or less at the same level tank queue is in the gutter. And I think that's because slowly over time, people have realized that, I mean, the Season 9 changes have changed the way the tank works. But at the end of the day, you still are just the butt of the joke. You are just the person that nobody cares about. You are the dump role that has to be played in order for other people to be able to enjoy the video game. You are the definition and not the focus. Even if you are the focus, then you have a terrible experience. Realistically, I think everyone acknowledges that tank is a terrible experience in 5v5. I think some people say they prefer 5v5 more, but I've never heard a tank player with any credibility whatsoever say that 5v5 is better for them. I've never heard somebody say that, unless specifically they just say, I want to be a fucking massive DPS, right? I've never heard anyone with credibility say that. And it'd be interesting if anyone has a link to anyone that is saying that, so I can look at what the fuck they're talking about. Because, Jesus Christ, like, what the hell? You see here, there's just this long list of history with support, DPS, tank, support, tank, of just the things that we're missing. And what that leads you to believe is that these fucking idiots that have always been saying, well, what can we do? We can't increase the player base numbers. There's nothing we can do in order to do that. We should just ignore it. Why don't we just release another DPS hero instead of releasing a tank hero? I mean, the tank hero is the dump role anyway. Maybe when we release Vendetta into the DPS category instead of the tank category, maybe we're just doing a disservice to everyone, right? Maybe even if Vendetta is 10% better in the DPS category, maybe the game gets worse, question mark. And certainly I do think that Vendetta is a 6v6 tank. Might not be a 5v5 tank, certainly a 6v6 tank. And I think with very small tweaks, you can become a 5v5 tank. So I want to talk a bit about the things you can do to increase player base numbers. I've talked about this before, but I feel like I haven't given a full list in the past. And I really want to just like give you some pointers if you actually want to get a player base going. So number one, the number of characters. Increase number of characters, increase role diversity in the fantasy of the characters, increase the number of heroes in the role. People, for the most part, play heroes because they want to play the fucking hero. It's a hero-based shooter. The player count for Genji is mostly based on the people that want to be a cyber ninja. That is obvious and pretty simple, and I don't think anyone debates this, right? The player count for the DPS is, in part, a proportion of that is due to the people that want to play Genji and the people that want to play Cassidy and Widow and Freya, and these individual characters all have individual impacts dependent on their hero fantasy as to who wants to actually play. Okay, so number two, gameplay. You can improve the average experience of the role. You can make the role not be hated on by shitloads of CC. You can make the role more enjoyable to play. You can make the role actually interesting. Now, 5v5 makes this very fucking difficult. Do you know why it makes it difficult? Because the average gameplay in 5v5 has always, historically, will always suck. It is bad. It is not interesting. There is no serious person that does not treat 5v5 tank as anything but a dump roller. Somebody has to play it. Somebody has to be that person that takes it on. There's a lot of reason for that. It's because tanks in 5v5 are just big DPS. Big DPS cross-pollinates from the DPS role. Some people want to play the DPS role. They don't want to play the bigger DPS role. It's because tanks in 5v5 have to be lethal, so you lost out on a lot of your original gameplay, which was space control. Do you know where those players go for the most part? They tend to go into the DPS and the support category, because when the tanks are so resource demanding that they have to be lethal, and they can't really space control in a off-tanky style way where they can control angles instead of standing on main, well, you end up with those characters and those off-tank players playing things like Genji. I'm going to be honest, quite a lot of the off-tank players transitioned over to some of the DPS that are a lot more tanky, or some of the supports that have reliable resources so they can be a lot more tanky. I transitioned over to Illari, because Illari has consistent healing. Venture especially, in Venture, yeah, there's a lot of characters in the DPS category that are just taken away from the tank category. It's because tanks will always be more hated on abilities in 5v5. That's pretty obvious. Even after Season 9, even after all the stuff, there's a lot of variance there. Doomfist does literally nothing when you've got the CC, does a lot when you don't have the CC, and Doomfist can ban out the CC, so there's a lot of variety in the type 6 tank category. Tends to get 2 bans per game. I don't know if you guys have noticed. That kind of sucks, right? That is a downer on the gameplay because you can't play the fucking character you want to play. Tanks are obviously more powerful. They're going to get more bans. It's always going to happen. And then there's the normal ones, right? Is the tanks have the most responsibility. They're the most blamed. They require the most knowledge. They are incredibly punishing if you make mistakes on them. And I think everyone just agrees the tank gameplay loop is terrible. Sorry to say it 3 times, but Jesus Christ, it's so bad. And then number 3 is diversity. This is not the diversity that's in the representation in the category. It's the role diversity of gameplay loop. It's the role diversity of niche gameplay loops, the variety within the niches. It's the decreased diversity of niches already filled by the cast, right? And that being caused by 5v5, because 5v5 has very certain demands of the player base. So some of the things that it demands, I've already said. I said this to Spilo a couple of... Well, I think it's about 2 months ago now. I went for a list with him when we talked about Roadhog. So 5v5 demands, right, the format needs some reasonable level of sustain in order for you to generally be able to stand on point. That's what it demands of a tank. It demands at least some sharp interactions shaving off of the tanks, right? You can't be fully hated on by CC. It demands general damage structure from all sources to not be too hating on the tank. It demands predictable, consistent pressure from the tank, so you can't be too spiky and you can't have too long downtimes. And then it requires more consistency in the uptime of the pressure. So it demands you to have things like Winston right click, a little bit more range from Reinhardt with the 2 fire strikes, stuff like that. And to note here, these are demands of the format, right? They need that. And every time you need something, you take away from the diversity you can make within the role. And the other thing is that we need to be given some sort of lethality on the tank role. And obviously the DPS are going to have that lethality anyway, but the tank role now needs it. They can't not have it. I think it's pretty obvious, and everything's borne out at this point, that the player base count in any role is roughly proportional to the hero count on that role. I think it's been borne out by my pugs when we've moved Venture to the tank category and Sombra to the support category, and the numbers are actually even. I think the amount of players you get are roughly even. I think that if you make the average gameplay loop relatively reasonable for the tank category, and don't get me wrong, tanks do require more knowledge. They do require more commitment to the game. That means that fostering a tank player base is going to take a little bit longer than fostering a support player base or fostering a DPS player base. I think that's pretty obvious. Squeed's right, it's pretty much always DPS that we lack in our mode. I think the support player base has always had a larger population just due to the amount of people that want to be playing more passively in Overwatch. One might question why, if there's a player base, a big player base of people that want to play a bit more passively, we've gone to a format in which they can't play a bit more passively. One might question that. I think that we have to expect that if the tank role only really caters to DPS players who want more responsibility and more blame on top of the DPS role by just making them big DPS in 5v5, while at the same time having more demand for them, making them just an offshoot of the DPS category of a just greedier DPS player that wants higher highs and lower lows. I think that's always going to suck, because the DPS category will always have enough variance to have these higher highs and lower lows. And then I think if the role can't be diversified into more interesting niches, for instance, I've said before, if we cannot have an RTS style tank, right? That cannot exist. An Ashe style tank that throws out Bob and Bob is the tank for the Ashe player, that would never work in 5v5. But realistically in 6v6, I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work, because it's so much more permissive on uptime and downtime of pressure and big power spikes and quirky and janky stuff is so much more permissive to that. If we can't diversify the tank role due to the 5v5 format because of all the restriction placed on them, the Overwatch team will struggle always to make new designs. They're always going to have problems, and I'm going to speculate here that this new character was originally a tank, or at the very least they've had a lot of thought into it that it might be a tank. And I just think that the team's going to continue to struggle to make new designs for tanks which have interesting gameplay loops and varied roles in a team. I don't think there really is much more you can create. I think we've filled all the niches. We've filled all the space. We've populated the niches. We have all the dive characters, the poke characters, and now we're looking to diversify. We're in a kind of like section where we have enough population in all of the categories, so essentially what we need to do is we need to, I don't know, invest in going in on stupid concepts in order to make the game more interesting. And instead, what have we got? We got Magic 2.0, right? Like, we got a character that is fine. Like, she's fine, don't get me wrong. But, like, really? Is this all we're getting? We're doing a League of Legends and just adding more heroes with the same stuff? And do you know why that is, Maxi, in League of Legends? Because League of Legends also has an incredibly high demand on what a character can be. It's the same thing that I was saying about Deadlock. Deadlock's one of these games that, sure, it's really cool, but every single character in Deadlock needs to have a good laning phase. And if you need to have a good laning phase, you have all these restrictions on what you can be that doesn't need to exist in a hero-based shooter. Why are we in the genre with the most diversity that exists and then making it less interesting? I don't understand. I don't understand.